I'm a product manager currently at TripAdvisor, working in our experiences business unit, and what that is it's a marketplace. So on TripAdvisor, both travelers and suppliers on the other side of the marketplace can sell experiences. So that's tours, activities, etc. around the world. And at the moment, I'm focused on the supply side of that marketplace. I'd consider, and so the talk tonight is a bit about product across the different sizes of companies. So rather than, I think last time I talked about problem solving and it was going into some of the technicalities of it, this time I'll talk about how product management is maybe different depending on the type of company and the size and the stage that the company that you're working in is at. So I wanted to share some of my experiences from both working in startups and in enterprise companies about some of the differences and also some of the similarities and some of the skills that I think are transferable across all of those companies. Previously to that, I was working at a fintech startup called Manice, where I was sort of the first product manager there after Series A funding and set up the product function essentially. Before that, I'd worked at Shazam too and done some mobile app consultancy. It was kind of back then, sort of 6-7 years ago, it was sort of project management. It wasn't really the sort of discipline that it is now, but learned some good experiences in that too. So as I mentioned, I want to talk tonight about startup versus enterprise product management, and it's not just startup versus enterprise. I'll talk a bit about the different types of companies and the different company sizes and what I see as being the sort of type of product managers you'll find in those companies at that stage, and why a product manager who works when you're a startup might not necessarily work when you're an enterprise company, and the different skill sets that are needed there. So this is my very sort of basic scribbled 4 stages of a company from my PM perspective. So I see there being the early stage, which is kind of pre-seed or very sort of low seed funding companies. And then you have Series A funded startups, so startups that are starting to get more money being pumped into them. And then you've got what I consider scaling startups, so startups that have achieved product market fit and are scaling in the marketplace, and that they're starting to grow and they have multiple product managers in that company. And then you've got this sort of enterprise scale that I would consider tech companies that have IPO'd or gone public or are very well funded, so they have thousands of employees. And even you're starting to talk about, banks and corporations that have been around for a long time, would sort of group them in that enterprise product management category. So I've got a couple of pictures about space, and I think it sort of it explains it quite well about the different stages of the company and how it relates to product management. So I would say, and I'm not going to focus too much on early stage tonight, and you can see here that I think it's a bit of a product vacuum. So early stage companies, I don't think you need a product manager necessarily. I think quite often it's a founder. You might have a couple of people, but typically the product is being run by the founder and the person who starts up the company, and it's all about getting the idea off the ground initially. And for that reason, quite often, the product function is not necessarily required in those early stage companies. It's sort of too soon in those companies for that to happen. And I'm not saying that as an absolute. It may work for some people, but typically you would find that product managers don't really, in their sort of traditional role, exist in early stage companies. And this is before they're getting significant amounts of funding. The second stage, I would say, in the startup, so as a product manager, quite often at this point, once you do get funded and is maybe a large seed round or Series A funding, then you're typically hiring a product manager. So they're going to be the first person into these companies. And it tends to be that once you get that level of funding, the founder's responsibilities, if they're also the CEO, tends to be more than just thinking about the product. So they're looking about how they secure the next funding. They're looking at the business model, they're looking at hiring people, so their attention is being diverted away from the product. And it typically is then when you need to make your first product hire. And as you're onboarding more designers and engineers and analysts into your team, as it grows, you start to need someone who, one, comes in and shapes the product function, and then starts to think about how do we hire other product managers and structure the business. And then you have these sort of scaling stage companies where I'd say if you were first going to the moon, then you're thinking about going to Mars. So you're starting to have multiple initiatives. So you have multiple squads within your team, and you're starting to think about, okay, maybe there's different verticals we're starting to think about, maybe there's different countries and different markets we need to go to, and you start to have more product managers, and you have a bigger product function in a scaling company. And as I mentioned later on, I'll talk about why these different stages mean you need different types of product managers sometimes at those different stages of companies. But typically at the scaling stage, that's where you're starting to get, you've suddenly gone from 50 people and you seem to be doubling in headcount all the time. So you go into 100, then you go into 200, and you go into 500, and very quickly the business is scaling and the user base is growing with it, and you need a growing product function and engineering function to support that. And then you kind of have the large orchestra that I would say is enterprise product management. So this is public companies, and they operate around the world. They have offices around the world. They have teams that are either co-located, or you're working with teams across different time zones. You have maybe many different business units. So in the case of TripAdvisor, we're sort of separated into many different functions. We have a hotels business, we have a restaurants business, we have an experiences business. Within those, they all have their own product functions. So it's very, very different type of product management. And sometimes you're working on initiatives in those types of companies where what you might be doing might be impacting another area, and you have to be conscious of that. But it's a very different type of product management. And quite often as well, if you're a public company, you're obviously accountable to the market as well. And that starts to impact how you think about product and how you start to sort of validate and be confident in the ideas that you're working on. It's a different task to trying to grow a business and grow a product to one where you're trying to maintain revenue or grow revenue, and you're reporting that back to the market. So as I mentioned, I won't spend too long on this one, but early stage companies, it tends to be a product vacuum. So it's often the CEO and the founder, and you might have the engineer who's building the product, maybe the CEO is also the engineer in building the product. You have a handful of people, and you're trying to validate your idea. So you're trying to get your idea off the ground, you're trying to prove that it's maybe got legs. You might not even be building anything at this stage. So you might be putting together a pitch deck, you might be putting together a prototype, and you're taking your idea to people, and you're trying to get support and initial funding to at least get it going and get it working. But in this kind of environment, there's often no need for the product function because of this, because you're not working with teams of engineers, teams of designers. There's often a couple of people trying to validate that initial idea. But in saying that, product management is a great proving ground to go and become a founder yourself, I think. So you see many examples of this over the years, and particularly in the large tech companies like Google, Facebook, etc. There's lots of ex-product managers who then go away and get involved in starting up startups or advising investment companies in startups. I think it's a great place to learn about building a business. And then sort of transferring those skills later, if you do have your own idea, to then go and take it and run with it. And I think it's whilst I say there's no product function in this stage of a business, often the founder is doing the product role in some way. And that's why I think product management is a great place to start, learn and grow your career. If you then have ambitions of also starting your own business one day, I think it really teaches you the skill set in being able to do that and take an idea right the way through from inception to shipping it in the marketplace and learning from it and trying to be successful. As I mentioned, there's normally only a handful of people at this stage of a company. So 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever it might be. But it's not well funded. Maybe people are funding it from their own money, and at that point in time, there's not a need for the product management role. So first of all, I want to really focus on a startup PM and share some of my experiences at Manise about working in a startup. I do want to say as well, I think this is just a personal opinion, but I think a startup is a fantastic place to learn as a product manager, but I don't think it's a great place for a first job as a product manager. Because if you're going into a company that has no product function and you are the first product manager in the door and it's your first job, yes, you're going to learn a lot and it's going to be fantastic. in that sense, but it's also, I think in the early stage of your career, in the first year or two, you could really benefit from being around a product community. And not just a product community, but being around an experienced engineering team as well, experienced design team that would help you. And I think a startup is fine to go into if there's a product function there, but if you're going in as your first job, I applaud you, and it's brave to do it, and you're going to learn a lot, and you will enjoy the experience. But one of the difficulties you'll find is that you can feel isolated at times, and I certainly felt isolated, even though I'd been doing the product job for a long time. When I first went into a startup and you're on your own and there's no team, essentially, it can be difficult because you don't have that community to leverage, and quite often you're trying to then leverage contacts outside of your workplace who you used to work with for advice on things. And I think one of the great things about working in sort of scaling or larger companies is that you do have that product community. Like here at the product school, for example, you have a community of people that you can leverage and seek advice on. In a startup, you can't necessarily do that, and it can be an isolating place at times. But as I mentioned, a very sort of Series A startup I'm sort of talking about, or large seed round. I'm taking it from my perspective at Manice, but you might be the first product hire. So the CEO has decided that now that you have funding, they need someone to come in and shape the product function. You're starting to think about hiring engineers. You're starting to think about hiring designers. You need someone who is going to take the CEO's vision and start to shape that into a product vision, and start to shape a function that is able to take those ideas and start delivering them with some consistency to the market as well. And that's where the product role starts to come in a startup. And you may or may not have a product development team. So when I first walked through the door at Manice, and I'd been in a company, well, I'd come there from Shazam, and it was quite a mature product function. And I walked into Manice, and I was given a laptop and a desk, and then told that I had no engineers. So, and then the first engineer was not starting for a couple of days. So you're sort of confronted with a very different reality in some startups. We had initially built the first version of the app through outsourcing it to a development agency, and once the funding had come through and the idea was validated, it was time to start building that product team in-house. And from that point, I just happened to be hired and could start before the engineers could start. So I was the first person in the door with a laptop. And it's very different, as mentioned, because you then really do have, it's a blank canvas. So whereas you go into a larger size company, they have processes in place. They have, there's ways of doing product that they've learned over the years, and they have their own unique way of doing it in that company. When you're in a startup, it's kind of, okay, you go and create that product function. Go and hire the engineers, go and hire the designers. Here's a list for the next 5 years that the founder has for a roadmap. And quite often it's a roadmap that you've committed to investors, where it's always ambitious, right? So they've said in 12 months we would deliver things that will take 5 years to deliver. And so you're kind of sat there and thinking, what do I prioritize? What do we do first? We need to first get in engineers, and you might be a month into the role before you actually have the engineers in the door to start working on things properly as well. So it's a very different challenge, and that's why I would say I think people would benefit from a couple of years in a sort of larger company within a larger product function to see best examples of product functions and how to set them up, and then at least trying to sort of replicate some of those processes in the startup. And that's at Manice. I took a lot of the good things we did at Shazam and tried to replicate that, and that sort of largely worked. There's obviously lots of flaws and lots of learnings in doing that, but trying to build in a culture initially of keeping things small and starting to ship things as a team was like one of the first things that I believe was really key in the startup to getting things moving. So once you start to hire engineers and you hire designers, rather than thinking about let's build this rocket ship right now, quite often it was the first couple of weeks was looking at the product and saying, okay, we've got these bugs, we've got these small optimizations we need to do as a team. Let's just get in the process of going through a cycle. So let's get in the process of designing it, let's get in the process of shipping it, and let's get in the process of learning it and doing it within a couple of days. So as a team, we start to feel confident in going through that process together. Because product is all about that life cycle and ultimately getting something to market. And I know there's a lot of discussion, a lot of thought around as well, like the sort of lean startup processes, etc. And the research that you put in up front and speaking to customers and the validation. But as a product team, your goal as well is to get stuff out. And it'd be amazed sometimes in startups where they don't get stuff out and they run out of money before they get stuff out. So you've got to get into the habit of being able to ship things quickly and get as a team that's coming together, and you're all coming into that new, sort of building that chemistry where you get used to shipping things together. And if you're going to take a startup role, the relationship with the founder is really, really critical to success. Because this is someone who it's their idea. They've decided maybe they're going to commit the next 20, 30 years, the rest of their life to this idea and building it. And that they're obviously super passionate about that idea. So when you come into that business, your relationship with them is going to be critical to the success of the startup. And I'll talk about it more and more as we go the different sizes of the business, but relationship building and product management is often overlooked. But it's one of the most important things in the job, because if you don't have a good relationship with the founder that you're working with, if you don't have a good relationship with your stakeholders and engineers, ultimately you won't get buy-in or have the influence that you would like to have, and you will start to struggle. So relationship building, particularly in the startup, being very close to the CEO, and that doesn't mean agreeing to everything that they ask you to do. I think it's very healthy for the founder to try and find someone who also argues against their viewpoint at times. But I was fortunate at Manish where I did have a good relationship with the CEO, and we were able to have that healthy tension of maybe me saying, actually, we shouldn't go in this direction with the product, and he was willing to listen and trust me in that at times. And there were times as well where, as a product team, we were going down a direction that was against his vision, and he would step in and he would say that, but he could be frank about it. And that was part of the reason why we sort of got through the Series A to the Series B, and that the company continues to grow now. But that's very, very important. So if you're thinking about taking a job in a startup, or you do work in a startup, be very mindful and do the sort of research and homework that you're going to have the right dynamic and relationship with the founder, because it's really, really important to success. Everything else is irrelevant in the startup when you're in at that early stage if you don't have that good relationship. And one of the other things is you learn about, and I know some of you are on the course at the moment, so what you might be taught about product if you're in a startup, you can half throw it out of the window because you are going to be a product manager, you're going to be a customer support agent, so you're probably going to be on the phone speaking to customers quite often, dealing with support tickets. You're also going to be a tester, so you're going to be testing your product all the time. Some companies you might even be writing code, you just might have to do it, and you're also going to be a marketer. But this is not a negative. This is personally, I think it's, and I miss this now, but it's fantastic. You learn about all the different areas of a business, and you sort of, whilst you might not be great at, the customer support function or the testing function, you learn a lot about the full life cycle that goes into building not only building a product but sustaining a product as well afterwards. And I think it's a great skill, and I do recommend, as I mentioned, not a first job, but at some point in your product careers, work in a startup, because it does teach you a lot about the different areas of the business. And one of the actual drawbacks that I'll talk about later in enterprise is roles start to become more and more specialized, and you might lose touch with some of these functions, and that's not such a good thing. Whereas in a startup, you are very close to your customers, and you're spending a lot of time with your customers, and I think it's one of the important things as a product manager. You also have to have ruthless prioritization in a startup. So as I mentioned, you have a limited runway, and I think regardless of the vision, the goal in the startup ultimately to begin with as well is don't run out of money. So you have to make sure that you're ruthless in your prioritization. And for example, at Manice, at the time in the fintech markets, obviously it still is very competitive in London. We had Monzo and Revolut, etc. And it's very easy to get distracted about those companies and what they were doing. So they were going after a different audience. Manice, for those who are not familiar with the product, is more aimed at migrants coming into the UK who have a thin credit file and can't set up a bank account. So the real selling point of it was the fact that you could come from another country, banks wouldn't give you an account because they couldn't verify you, you had no credit file, and we could verify those customers very quickly on the phone, and they could be up and running and open their bank account, which meant they could get paid into that account, they could start to rent a property, because it's kind of this triangle of death where if you can't open a bank account, you can't get a mobile phone, you can't get anywhere to live, you can't get your salary paid into an account. And so we were very mindful that our audience was different to Monzo and Revolut. We weren't going after, the sort of Monzo to begin with, not so much now. The sort of tech-savvy Shoreditch crowd was Monzo initially, and Revolut was more aimed at. It was kind of like the investment banking community, but there was a lot of benefits around trading and favourable FX rates, and also spending money often if you're going abroad on business, etc. And that wasn't the audience for Manice, and it was very easy. And in our own teams, as PMs, as designers there, as developers, to get distracted about look at this cool feature that Monzo's just shipped, look at this cool feature Revolut's just shipped. In a startup, if you get distracted by that, and you only have a year's worth of funding, and you're not solving the problem you'd initially set out to solve, you might find that you run out of money and don't have many users, and you have essentially a Monzo-like product, which in the marketplace is not going to succeed. So I think being very clear about the goal of the company and the product vision, and prioritizing very ruthlessly against that is very important to succeed in a startup. And I mentioned it earlier, and it's a buzzword. There's many books written about it, but lean, lean, lean. I've seen this many times. You can get carried away in a startup building for scale. So I see this very often. So if you're building a transaction system and you're building it to handle millions of transactions and payments per day, well, if you've only got 2,000 customers, why are you building that solution right now? Because you haven't proven that you've got the product market fit to scale to that size. And what ends up happening is that you start building a system that's complex and is meant for scaling the company in the next 5 years. But in building that system, you've taken up most of your engineering resource, you've maybe spent 6 months, lots of money, and you've not delivered any impact for your customers. You've not grown the business. And it's a common problem. It sounds like something that people should avoid, but you don't build for scale initially. You just do not do it because you will run out of time, you will run out of money, and you haven't achieved product market fit with your business. And I would always encourage finding non-engineering solutions to validate your problem, particularly in a startup. And the classic example is Airbnb. So in the early days of Airbnb, those that are familiar with the story, they validated that business by blowing up the airbed in their apartment and inviting people to come and pay to sleep on the airbed, right? And there's no engineering solution to that. It's a very simple hack. One that is also very popular now, particularly on e-commerce sites, is 404 test. So if you're working out whether to offer, giving an example, say a certain payment method in a particular country or market, and we're talking about, a couple of months maybe to do the integration. It's complex. We're not sure if people want it. Should we do it? You can put the payment method on your checkout, and when someone clicks on that payment method, yes, it's not a great user experience, but you say to them, sorry, this is not available. We're researching it, but you measure intent quickly. So within a few days, depending on your traffic and the scale of the business, you can get a very good understanding in a production environment of what is people's motivation around that feature. You don't need to build it first. You can validate it through doing something like that. It's a growth hacking technique, but it's used a lot now. And it's actually a very effective and cheap way of validating a problem, because customer interviews, user research will only tell you so much as well. But I find nowadays with user research and usability testing, so it was popularized by Google Ventures, and there's the design sprint methodology, where people tend to overuse it now. So they validate ideas and prototypes with 5 people, but it's a usability test. So it's uncovering usability problems in the solution that you've designed. It's not necessarily telling you if what you've built is solving the problem, because you've got 5 users who are clicking through on a prototype, and what you're really getting is feedback around the usability of that prototype. If you want to start to understand, is this something that's going to work for 100,000 people or millions of people, and are they going to be motivated to use it? Then 404 tests and doings like that are a very good way to test and validate. So I think enterprise product management, and I consider myself in this space now at TripAdvisor as well, and I think Google, Facebook, many of the large tech companies and companies that aren't tech companies, I would classify them in this space. You're either a public company, a company that's been going a long time, and you have a large product organization. So there are many stakeholders and lines of communication, and that becomes a very different challenge, because whereas in a startup you might have a couple of people and you group together and you're building something quickly, you suddenly find yourself, you need to influence and get buy-in from many people, quite often many people around the world. And that starts to determine your success even more than your ability to actually build product and deliver product. So it becomes about how well can you influence people and negotiate with people as well. And it's something that I'm having to transition and learn to as well at the moment. But quite often, it's a mature product. So you're dealing with years and years of legacy tech. So, Ethan, I once had, I hope I get in trouble for saying it, but I had a meeting with Google. So we were doing some work at Shazam and integrating their ads into the product through the YouTube video ads. And we were talking to the guys at YouTube, and we just couldn't get it to work, right? They couldn't get it to work, we couldn't get it to work. And then they admitted to us that the person who originally built this code, left the business a few years ago. It was written 5-10 years ago. Nobody in the business has any idea how it works, but it kind of works and no one wants to touch it. So these are the kind of problems you start then, and you wouldn't maybe think it happens at Google, but it happens at Google, happens at Facebook. There's legacy code, it's written in, the common one now, everyone's using Java, but a lot of web apps used to be written in PHP, and now you don't have a lot of PHP engineers, and people don't want to work on PHP code. So you have these old legacy systems, and as a product manager, you're thinking, okay, we need something in a startup that would take you a week, suddenly you're looking at months to do it, right? Because you're having to understand how that legacy system works, how that legacy product works, and you get into this scenario of should we just rebuild it? But then can you rebuild it when hundreds of millions of people use it? Not very quickly and not without a lot of pain. And so it's a very, very different challenge. Startups are great because you have a new code base. It's almost like a greenfield and off you go. In enterprise companies, very, very different challenge as a product manager. And before we talk about this one as well, so in a mature product, it becomes very important, I think. This is where, again, it differs, and people talk about lean product management, right, and moving quickly. In this space, you can't do it because you really need to spec things out and understand how the old systems are working and the impact of your changes and what's going to happen. Because if you don't and you move too quickly, you could end up breaking systems which cost the company millions very quickly. And it becomes, you need to start to spend a lot more time diving into systems, speccing out problems, and really starting to understand them before you commit to engineering. Now, you hear a lot of stuff about that's not the way to do product, but doing products in a startup sort of mentality, There's lots of good things that we should be doing like that in enterprise companies, but you can't completely work in that way in a larger company, because the consequence of the error, consequence of it going wrong when you have millions of users and shareholders to account to versus a couple of thousand users, the consequence of that is significant. And that's why it becomes very, very different, and you have to be a lot more meticulous around how you spec out features as well. One of the differences as well is that you have specialist roles and support functions. So in a startup, I mentioned that you do a bit of everything. In an enterprise company, you might have a product manager, you might have a UX researcher, you might have a UI designer, you have a manual tester, automation tester, engineering team, tech lead, scrum master, you name it, marketing person. Like, you have all of these specialist roles. So again, it starts being more about, it's much more of a sort of a team effort. So how well do you function with that team and get the best out of each other? Because product really becomes like a negotiation game at that point. And being able to work within that team to build the product. And I'd say it's very different to a startup where you're sort of maybe doing half those jobs yourself, and you have an engineer and you just kind of get on with it. Here you're having to, and it's great as well because you get to utilize like the expertise of lots of different people. Like in a startup, I'd have loved to have had all the analysts that I have now, right? So when you talked earlier about how do you build things and keep an eye on the data, well, you kind of almost don't have to do that in a larger company because you have an analyst working in the product team where they know what you're looking at and they can proactively come to you as well and say, hey, we've noticed this is not trending the right way. So you have a lot more support there. And it's why I mentioned as well, sort of scaling companies, enterprise companies are good initially as well for product managers to kind of learn and leverage that. There's positives and negatives, right? You probably don't learn as much about the role as a whole and all the different aspects of it, but you do learn about the processes and structures that will lead you to being a successful team. There's a lot more emphasis as well, particularly in public companies, on owning the profit and loss. So in a startup, quite often it might be about growth and retention and whatever it might be, right? Those particular statistics that people are looking at. In an enterprise company, you're starting to really think about how does this impact the revenue as well. So you're starting to take a lot of accountability around, should we spend the next 3 months working on this feature and allocating 6 engineers to it if it's not going to impact the P&L of the business? You have to work with large finance teams, and you will start to be questioned a lot as a product manager on how does this really impact the business? How does it move it forward in terms of revenue? How does it impact, what the share price is going to be at times? And sometimes that's might not be always the right way to do products, but you'll find you get asked these questions a lot more in a compared to a startup where you're thinking about growing the user base, you're thinking about creating a fantastic customer experience, one that differentiates. Here you're also starting to really think about optimizing and how do I optimize the profit and loss for the company. It starts to become quite different. And I mentioned, I think you need to be a diplomat in enterprise companies, and sometimes this gets me into trouble when I still go through gung-ho in a startup mentality and do things, but you need to build consensus. Otherwise you lose trust and support of people quite quickly. And I always compare it to politics. I was told that in politics, when you go to vote on something, and I think probably Theresa May found this out about Brexit, but when you try and get people to vote on stuff, you need to build consensus before the vote and the meeting happens. If you don't engage with people, listen to differences of opinion and build consensus, you're going to be torn apart when it comes to the actual meeting. And this is something that's very important in product and enterprise companies as well. So we quite often have feature reviews or kickoffs where everyone's in the room, but the kickoff shouldn't be the first time your major stakeholders are hearing about it. You need to have engaged with them weeks before and understand their questions, their issues of what you're trying to do. And if you do that, you can be successful. But if you kind of rush things through and don't consult, it can actually be very difficult and you come up against a roadblock quite quickly. And that's what I've found one of the sort of shifts one of the major shifts I've had to learn in a larger company is building that sort of the consensus as well. And that's not I don't think it's a bad skill to learn. I think it's a good skill to learn, but it is one of the major differences. And you spend a lot of time doing this. So you probably spend less time with your teams working on building stuff, and your role starts to be half my week I'm talking and building consensus and talking about the next things that we're working on in an enterprise environment. And I think importantly, one of the things here as well is you're actually competing for resources in these companies, and it's published at companies like even in Google, for example. They actually grade their product managers at different levels every year as well, and how they assess them. So you're sort of you're competing not only for resources, but assessed on like the impact that you're having versus other product managers. So you have to start to be very comfortable at selling your product vision constantly. And it's one of the things that I'm learning a lot now is being a lot clearer around what is my product vision. Quite often when you're going to those meetings, they're not interested in the detail, they're interested in the story and the vision. And they're interested in, if we buy into this, what's the impact going to be for the company? So it often becomes, you need to start to become a storyteller and really have a clear idea of what your product vision is. Whereas and you're competing against other teams for those engineering resources, essentially. Whereas in a startup, to begin with, it can be quite clear what maybe you need to do in the next 3 months, next 6 months. When you're looking at a mature product, and it may be saturated in the market, you're thinking about, there could be 15, 20, 30, 40 different ideas and things that you could do. You really need to have a strong business case and sell your idea. Otherwise, you'll find that, for the next quarter, maybe you don't have as many engineers working on some of your problems. So that's definitely one of the differences as well. And in my team, we have a big product community just in our area. We have 60, 70 product managers working on different initiatives and all selling in their ideas. So it's something that's also exciting, but you have to get used to that environment. It can be quite different to being the only PM or working with a handful of product managers, and the founder has a clear idea, the vision of the company. Quite often at scale, the founder's, vision, maybe it's been realized, but they don't have, as massive a say into the roadmap. There's lots of different business units and teams, and it becomes more of a negotiation. One of the other things I want to very quickly mention in this space, so I was going to talk about in the scaling space, but you also start to get into optimization mode a lot more. So rather than building things that are new in a startup, you're also looking at your existing product and thinking, how can I improve it? And this is normally where you start to think about we think about A/B testing a lot. So on the consumer side or whatever it might be, how do we start to measure small incremental changes that are going to move things by a couple of percent? And you're not always thinking about what's the next feature we need to build, but you're thinking about what do I need to optimize and improve that's already there, and also what's in the product that is just crap, it doesn't work, and I need to get rid of it. So you're also starting to think about those decisions, and that's quite different to a startup can be, let's build it. You're trying to build the house, whereas in here you're very much trying to optimize what you have as well, and get the most out of what you have and improve it incrementally as well. Just some shared traits that I think are important across any type of organization. So I think being close to your customers. This is something that I'm passionate about, and I think one of the things that I've learned in a startup is I think startups are great for being close to customers, and I've tried to take that into larger companies as well. So every week, either doing user testing or looking through support chats myself or answering support chats myself. I think being very close to the customers still. Whilst they might not tell you what to build, you can start to see, you can start to draw between the lines and see where the problems are and where you might prioritize your time. I think it's the most important thing to do as a product manager, to be close to your customers. I think if you're close to your customers, people talk about product intuition. Product intuition, I think, is being close to your customers and not necessarily building what they tell you to build, but having an understanding of their pain and their problem And I think if you do that, you won't go far wrong. And I think I spoke about that last time I was here. Relationships with stakeholders, whether it's a startup or whether it's an enterprise, your founder, your stakeholders, your team, it's so important that you have good relationships with them. And if you don't have good relationships with your team, it can be very, very difficult to have influence. Because you're a product manager and you might not have, you don't necessarily manage anyone or have direct influence over people, so you have to be good at relationship building. And importantly, solve problems, don't build features. It's a common one. People get excited about building new features. Actually, what we're trying to do is solve problems, really understanding the problem and trying to solve the problem. And it maybe there's a technical solution to solve the problem. Maybe there's not a technical solution. Maybe there's something that works that's not technical, but it's understanding the problem that you're trying to solve.